The air hung heavy with the stench of stale beer and regret. Rain lashed against the windows of the dimly lit bar, the drunken serpent mirroring the turmoil brewing within Jack. His reflection stared back from the half-empty bottle of whiskey, a hollow shell of the man he once was. Each swig of the amber liquid was an attempt to drown the sorrows that gnawed at his soul. Jack had made a grave mistake, one that haunted his waking hours and bled into his dreams. A mistake that had cost him everything. He had lost his job, his wife, his life as he knew it. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, threatening to crush him entirely. As the night wore on, the bar remained nearly empty, save for a few lonely souls seeking solace in the bottom of a glass. A haze of cigarette smoke hung low, shrouding the room in an eerie, almost spectral glow. Jack raised his glass to his lips, the ice clinking against the rim, a hollow reminder of the life that had slipped through his fingers. He yearned for an escape, a way to outrun the consequences of his actions. A sudden chill snaked down Jack's spine, pulling him from his melancholic reverie. He swore he felt a pair of eyes on him, watching his every move. Slowly, he lifted his gaze from his drink, his heart pounding against his ribs. In the darkest corner of the bar, shrouded in shadows, sat a man. His features were obscured by the dim lighting, but Jack could make out the silhouette of a fedora pulled low over his brow. The man's attire was as dark and enigmatic as the night itself, a long black coat that seemed to absorb the meager light, a stark contrast to the drab surroundings. The stranger sat motionless, a solitary figure amidst the scattered patrons. An aura of mystery clung to him, an unspoken power that sent shivers down Jack's spine. He couldn't explain it, but something about the man unsettled him to his core. Jack tried to dismiss the unease as a trick of the light and the whiskey coursing through his veins. He forced himself to look away, to focus on anything but the unsettling figure in the shadows. But his gaze kept being drawn back, as if compelled by an unseen force. The man in the shadows remained unmoving, his presence a heavy weight in the room. Jack's curiosity battled with his apprehension, urging him to learn more about this enigmatic figure. Finally, curiosity won out over his unease. Mustering a surge of liquid courage, Jack rose unsteadily from his bar stool and made his way through the hazy bar towards the stranger. With each step, the stranger's presence seemed to grow stronger, the air around him buzzing with an unseen energy. "Excuse me," Jack began, his voice barely a whisper above the low hum of conversation. "Mind if I join you?" The stranger didn't reply, didn't even acknowledge Jack's presence. He simply sat there, shrouded in shadow, his gaze fixed on some unknown point in the distance. For a moment Jack thought he'd been completely ignored. Then the man slowly tilted his head, a sliver of pale skin catching the light as he turned to face Jack. "I've been expecting you," the stranger rasped, his voice a low growl that sent shivers down Jack's spine. His eyes, two dark fathomless pools, seemed to pierce through Jack, reading his very soul. Jack stumbled back, startled by the man's words. "Expecting me? I don't understand." A humorless smile played at the corners of the stranger's lips, a chilling expression that did nothing to ease Jack's unease. "Oh, but we have," the stranger countered, his voice as smooth as silk. "Perhaps not in the way you imagine." He leaned closer, the faint scent of sandalwood and something ancient, something unsettling, wafting from him. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Jack's mind raced, trying to comprehend the stranger's cryptic words. "I assure you, you've mistaken me for someone else. I have nothing of yours." The stranger's smile widened, revealing a set of teeth that seemed too sharp, too predatory for a human. "You see, that's where you're wrong," he hissed. "You possess something of great value, something that was stolen from me, and I aim to reclaim it." Section 5. The Skull's Grim Gaze. Jack felt a chill crawl down his spine, settling in the pit of his stomach. The stranger's words weren't a request, but a threat, veiled beneath a veneer of civility. He wanted to leave, to get as far away from this unsettling individual as possible. But something held him rooted to the spot. "I don't know what you're talking about." Jack stammered, his voice barely audible above the pounding of his heart. The stranger chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that echoed through the nearly empty bar. He reached into the folds of his coat and produced a small velvet pouch. With deliberate slowness, he untied the drawstring and upended the bag onto the table. A human skull, bleached white with time, tumbled out, its empty sockets staring up at Jack with an accusing gaze. The skull seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the table. "Recognize this?" the stranger asked, his voice laced with amusement. Section 6. A pact sealed in darkness. Jack recoiled from the skull as if it had been a venomous snake. He had seen it before, a macabre curiosity displayed on a shelf above the bar. The bartender, a gruff man named One-Eyed Pete, had always claimed it was a family heirloom, passed down through generations. Now Jack wasn't so sure. "Where did you get that?" Jack choked out, his gaze darting between the skull and the stranger. "It matters little," the stranger replied, his gaze never leaving Jack's face. "What matters is that it was stolen from me, and I always collect what is owed." The air crackled with tension, thick enough to suffocate. Jack knew he was in over his head, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow entangled in something far more sinister than he could have ever imagined. "What do you want from me?" Jack asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. The stranger leaned in close, his breath warm against Jack's ear. "A simple task," he whispered. "Help me reclaim what is mine, and I will ensure your debt is paid." Section 7. The Weight of Guilt. Jack stared at the skull, its hollow gaze seeming to mock his predicament. He was trapped, caught between a rock and a hard place. His life was already in ruins, but to refuse the stranger's offer felt like inviting a fate far worse than anything he could imagine. The guilt of his past mistakes gnawed at him, fueling his desperation. He had nothing left to lose and everything to gain, or so he told himself. "What do I have to do?" Jack asked, his voice barely a whisper. He already regretted the words before they left his lips. The stranger's smile returned, cold and predatory. He leaned back, his gaze never leaving Jack's. "I knew you were a man of ambition," the stranger said, his voice smooth as silk. "All you need to do is retrieve the skull, bring it to me by midnight, and your debt will be considered paid." Fear warred with a strange sense of purpose within Jack. This was his chance, his opportunity to right his wrongs. What was one more questionable act in the grand scheme of his life? Jack glanced nervously over his shoulder as he approached the bar. The stranger remained seated in the shadows, his gaze fixed on Jack, as if willing him forward. The skull seemed to throb with an unnatural energy, its presence a heavy weight in Jack's hands. "Here," Jack said, placing the skull on the table before the stranger. He wanted nothing more than to wash his hands of this entire affair. The stranger's smile broadened, revealing a flash of teeth that gleamed unnaturally in the dim light. "Excellent," he purred, his voice a low rumble that reverberated through Jack's bones. "You've done well." He reached out and gently caressed the skull, his touch strangely tender. As he did, the air crackled with energy, and the lights in the bar flickered violently. "Do you know what this is?" the stranger asked, his voice laced with an odd reverence. Jack shook his head, unable to tear his gaze from the skull. It seemed to pulsate with a life of its own, its empty sockets boring into his soul. "This," the stranger said, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper, "is the key to unimaginable power." Confusion washed over Jack. "Power?" he echoed, his voice hollow. The stranger chuckled, a low rumbling sound that seemed to shake the very foundation of the bar. The kind that can reshape destinies, rewrite the past, alter the very fabric of reality, he explained, his eyes gleaming with an almost fanatical light, the kind that foolish mortals would kill for. Jack stared at the stranger, his mind struggling to grasp the implications of his words. This was madness, utter insanity. And yet a part of him, a dark, desperate part, wanted to believe. The stranger rose from his seat, towering over Jack. He reached into his coat and retrieved a small silver coin, etched with strange symbols. He pressed it into Jack's palm, closing his fingers around it. "Your debt is paid," the stranger said, his voice a raspy whisper. "But be warned, the world is a delicate balance. Use this power wisely, for even the smallest ripple can create a tsunami." And with that he turned and melted into the shadows, disappearing as quickly and mysteriously as he had arrived. Jack stood there for a long moment, the silver coin cold against his palm, the stranger's words echoing in his ears. He had sought solace from his sorrows, and instead, he had stumbled into a realm of shadows and secrets. He glanced around the bar, the familiar surroundings suddenly seeming alien and unsettling. The other patrons, lost in their own worlds of intoxication and despair, remained oblivious to the encounter that had just transpired. Jack stumbled out of the bar into the rain-soaked night, the weight of the stranger's words heavy on his heart. He didn't understand the true nature of the power he now possessed, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it came at a price. As he walked away from the drunken serpent, he cast one last glance over his shoulder. The bar, once a place of refuge, now seemed sinister, a den of shadows and whispers. Jack hurried through the deserted streets, the rain soaking through his clothes, mirroring the chilling truth that had settled deep within him. He had made a deal with a being beyond comprehension, traded a stolen skull for a power he barely understood. The silver coin in his pocket felt warm against his skin, a constant reminder of the pact he had made. It thrummed with an energy that both terrified and exhilarated him. He had been given a second chance, a way to undo his past mistakes. But at what cost? The stranger's warning echoed in his mind. The world is a delicate balance. Jack knew with a sinking feeling that his actions had consequences far beyond what he could have ever imagined. He had been a desperate man, seeking solace in the bottom of a bottle. Now, he was a puppet master, holding the strings of fate in his hands. The weight of the world, the weight of his choices, settled upon him, heavier than any burden he had ever borne. He had escaped the depths of his despair, only to find himself lost in a labyrinth of his own making. The rain continued to fall, a relentless torrent that mirrored the turmoil raging within him. He had traded one prison for another, shackled not by bars of iron, but by the chains of his own ambition and the chilling consequences of a power he could barely comprehend.